The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries by W.Y. Evans Wentz. In the public domain. Please don't sue. Chapter 2. The Taking of Evidence. During all these centuries, the Celt has kept in his heart some affinity with the mighty beings ruling in the unseen, once so evident to the heroic races who preceded him. His legends and fairy tales have connected his soul with the inner lives of air and water and earth, and they in turn have kept his heart sweet with hidden influence. So the outline of this chapter is method of presentation, the logical verdict, trustworthiness of legends, the fairy faith held by the highly educated Celt as well as by the Celtic peasant. The evidence is complete and adequate. Its analysis, the fairy tribes dealt with, witnesses and their testimony. From Ireland, with introduction by Dr. Douglas Hyde. From Scotland, with introduction by Dr. Alexander Carmichael. From the Isle of Man, with introduction by Miss Sophia Morrison. From Wales, with introduction by the Right Honourable Sir John Rhys. From Cornwall, with introduction by Mr. Henry Jenner. And from Brittany, with introduction by Professor Anatole Lebras. General introduction. Various possible plans have presented themselves for setting forth the living fairy faith as I have found it during my travels in the 6 Celtic countries among the people who hold it. To take a bit here and a bit there from a miscellaneous group of psychological experiences, fairy legends and stories, which are linked together almost inseparably in the mind of the one who tells them, does not seem at all satisfactory, nor even just, in trying to arrive at such a correct result. Classification under various headings, such, for example, changelings or appearances of fairies, seems equally unsatisfactory. For as soon as the details of folklore such as I am presenting are isolated from one another, even though brought together in related groups, they must be rudely torn out of their true natural environment, and divorced from the psychological atmosphere amidst which they were first presented by the narrator. Sorry. The same objection applies to any plan of dividing the evidence into 1. That which is purely legendary, 2. That which is second-hand or third-hand evidence from people who claim to have seen fairies or to have been in fairyland or under fairy influences, and 3. That which is first-hand evidence from actual percipients. These 3 classes of evidence are so self-evident that every reader will be able to distinguish each class for himself as it occurs, and a mechanical classification by us is unnecessary. So no plan seems so good as the plan I have adopted of permitting all witnesses to give their own testimony in their own way and in its own native setting, and then of classifying and weighing such testimony according to the methods of comparative religion and the anthropological sciences. Sorry again. In most cases, as examination will show, the evidence is so clear that little or no comment is necessary. Most of the evidence also points so much in one direction that the only verdict which seems reasonable is that the fairy faith belongs to a doctrine of souls. That is to say, that fairyland is a state or condition, realm or place, very much like, if not the same as, that wherein civilized and uncivilized men alike place the souls of the dead, in company with other invisible beings such as gods, daemons, and all sorts of good and bad spirits. Not only do both educated and uneducated Celtic seers so conceive fairyland, but they go much further and say that fairyland actually exists as an invisible world within which the visible world is immersed like an island in an unexplored ocean, and that it is peopled by more species of living beings than this world, because incomparably more vast and varied in its possibilities. We should be prepared in hearing the evidence to meet with some contradictions and a good deal of confusion, for many of the people who believe in such a strange world as we have just described, and who think they have sometimes entered it or have seen some of its inhabitants, have often had no training at all in schools or colleges. But when we hear legendary tales which have never been recorded save in the minds of unnumbered generations of men, we ought not on that account to undervalue them, for often they are better authorities and more trustworthy than many an ancient and carefully inscribed manuscript in the British Museum, and they are probably far older than the oldest book in the world. Let us then for a time forget that there are such things as libraries and universities, and betake ourselves to the Celtic peasant for instruction, living close to nature as he lives, thinking the things which he thinks. But the peasant will not be our only teacher, for we shall also hear much of the first importance from city folk of the highest intellectual training. It has become, perhaps always has been in modern times, a widespread opinion, even among some scholars, that the belief in fairies is the property solely of simple, uneducated country folk, and that people who have had a touch of education and a little common sense knocked into their heads, to use the ordinary language, wouldn't be caught believing in such nonsense. The same class of critics used to make similar remarks about people who said there were ghosts until the truth of another stupid superstition was discovered by psychical research. So in this chapter we hope to correct this erroneous opinion about the fairy faith, an opinion chiefly entertained by scholars and others who know not the first real fact about fairies because they have never lived amongst people who believe in fairies but derive all their information from books and hearsay. In due order, the proper sort of witnesses will substantiate this position. But before coming to their testimony, we may now say that there are men and women in Dublin and in other parts of Ireland, in Scotland, in the Isle of Man, and Brythonic lands too, whom all the world knows as educated leaders in their respective fields of activity, who not only declare their beliefs that fairies were, but that fairies are. And some of these men and women say that they have the power to see fairies as real spiritual beings. In the evidence about to be presented, there has been no selecting in favor of any one theory. It is presented as discovered. The only liberty taken with some of the evidence has been to put it into better grammatical form, and sometimes to recast an ambiguous statement when I, as collector, had in my own mind no doubt as to its meaning. Translations have been made as literal as possible, though sometimes it has been found better to offer the meaning rather than what in English would be an obscure colloquialism or idiomatic expression. The method pursued in seeking the evidence has been to penetrate as deeply and in as natural a way as possible the thoughts of the people who believe in fairies and like beings, by living among them and observing their customs and ways of thought, and recording what seemed relevant to the subject under investigation, chance expressions and legends told under various ordinary conditions, rather than to collect long legends or literary fairy stories. For these last, the reader is referred to the many excellent works on Celtic folklore. We have sought to bring together, as perhaps has not been done before, the philosophy of the belief in fairies, rather than the mere fairy lore itself, though the two cannot be separated. In giving the evidence concerning fairies, we sometimes give evidence which, though akin to it, and thus worthy of record, is not strictly fairy lore. All that we have omitted from the materials in the form first taken down are stories and accounts of things not sufficiently related to the world of fairy to be of value here. In no case has testimony been admitted from a person who was known to be unreliable, nor even from a person who was thought to be unreliable. Accordingly, the evidence we are to examine ought to be considered good evidence so far as it goes. And since it represents almost all known elements of the fairy faith and contains almost all the essential elements upon which the advocates of the naturalistic theory, of the pygmy theory, of the druid theory, of the mythological theory, as well as of our own psychological theory, must base their arguments, we consider it very adequate evidence. Nearly every witness is a Celt who has been made acquainted with the belief in fairies through direct contact with people who believe in them, or through having heard fairy traditions among his own kindred, or through personal psychological experiences. And it is exceedingly fortunate for us that an unusually large proportion of these Celtic witnesses are actual recipients and natural seers, because the eliminations from the fairy faith to be brought about in Chapter 3 by means of an anthropological analysis of evidence will be so extensive that, scientifically and strictly speaking, there will remain as a residual or unknown quantity upon which our final conclusion must depend, solely the testimony of reliable seer witnesses. That is to say, no method of anthropological dissection of the evidence can force aside consideration of the ultimate truth which may or may not reside in the testimony of sane and thoroughly reliable seer witnesses. Old and young, educated and uneducated, peasant and city-bred, testify to the actual evidence of the Celtic fairy faith. And the evidence from Roman Catholics stand beside that from Protestants. The evidence of priests supports that of scholars and scientists. Peasant seers have testified to the same kind of visions as highly educated seers. And what poets have said agrees with what is told by businessmen, engineers, and lawyers. But the best of witnesses, like ourselves, are only human and subject to the shortcomings of the ordinary man, and therefore no claim can be made in any case to infallibility of evidence. All the world over, men interpret visions pragmatically and sociologically, or hold beliefs in accord with their own personal experiences, and are forever unconsciously immersed in a sea of psychological influences, which sometimes may be explainable through the methods of sociological inquiry. Sometimes may be supernormal in origin and nature, and hence to be explained most adequately, if at all, through psychical research. Our study is a study of human nature itself, and moreover, often of human nature in its most subtle aspects, which are often psychical. And the most difficult problem of all is for human nature to interpret and understand its own ultimate essence and psychological instincts. Our whole aim is to discover what reasonableness may or may not be. Ow, kitty! Sorry, there's no peace in my house tonight. Our whole aim is to discover what reasonableness may or may not stand behind a belief so vast, so ancient, so common, contrary to popular non-Celtic opinion, to all classes of Celts, and so fundamental a shaping force in European history, religion, and social institutions. When we state our conviction that the fairy faith is common to all classes of Celts, we do not state that it's common to all Celts. The materialization of the age has affected the fairy faith, and it has affected all religious beliefs the world over. This has been pointed out by Dr. Hyde, by Dr. Carmichael, and by Mr. Jenner in their respective introductions for Ireland, Scotland, and Cornwall. Nevertheless, the fairy faith, as the folk religion of the Celtic peoples, is still able to count its adherents by hundreds of thousands. Even in the many cases where Christian theology has been partially or wholly discarded by educated Celts in the country or in the city as being to them in too many details out of harmony with accepted scientific truths, the belief in fairies has been jealously retained, and will, so it would seem, be retained in the future. We are now prepared to hear about the good people, as the Irish called their she race, about the people of peace, the still folk, or the silent moving folk, as the Scotch called their Sith. I probably mispronounced that. Who live in green knolls and in the mountain fastness of the Highlands. About various Manx fairies, about the Twilith Teg, the fair family, or fair folk, as the Welsh people call their fairies, about Cornish pixies, about fees, fairies, corrigans, and the phantoms of the dead in Brittany. And along with these, for they are very much akin, let us hear about ghosts, sometime about ghosts who discover hidden treasure, as in our story of the Golden Image, about goblins, about various sorts of death wardings generally coming from apparitions of the dead, or from banshees, about death candles and phantom funerals, about leprechauns, about hosts of the air, and all kinds of elementals and spirits. In short, about all the orders of beings who mingle together in that invisible realm called fairyland. In Ireland, introduction by Douglas Hyde, LLD, Doctor of Literature, MRIA, President of the Gaelic Language, author of A Literary History of Ireland. Whatever may be thought of the conclusions drawn by Mr. Wentz from his explorations into the Irish spirit world, there can be no doubt as to the accuracy of the data from which he draws them. I have, myself, been for nearly a quarter of a century collecting on and off the folklore of Western Ireland, not indeed in the shape in which Mr. Wentz has collected it, but rather with an eye, partly for linguistic and literary purposes, to its songs, sayings, ballads, proverbs, and which are generally the equivalent of the German Märchen, but sometimes have a touch of the saga nature about them. In making a collection of these things, I have naturally come across a very large amount of folk belief conversationally expressed with regard to the good people and other supernatural manifestations, so that I can bear witness to the fidelity of which Mr. Wentz has done his work on Irish soil. For to a great number of the beliefs which he records, I have myself heard parallels. Sometimes I have heard near variants of the stories, sometimes identical stories. So we may, I think, unhesitatingly accept his subject matter, whatever, as I have said, be the conclusions we may deduce from them. The folk tale or Märchen, which I have spent so much time in collecting, must not be confounded with folk belief, which forms the basis of Mr. Wentz's studies. The folk tale or story is something much more intricate, complicated, and thought out than the belief. One can quite easily distinguish between the two. One, the belief, is short, conversational, chiefly relating to real people and contains no great sequence of incidents, while the other, the folk tale, is long, complicated, more or less conventional, and above all has its interest grouped around a single central figure, that of the hero or heroine. I may make this plainer by example. Let us go into a cottage on the mountainside, as Mr. Wentz and I has often done, and ask the old man of the house if he ever heard such a thing as fairies, and he will tell you that there is fairies in it, surely. Didn't his own father see the fourth beyond full of them, and he passing by of a moonlit night, and a little piper among them, and he playing music that mortal man never heard the like. A fourth, Anglo-Irish for wrath, a circular earthen fort. Or he'll tell you that he himself wouldn't say again for fairies, for it's often he heard their music at the old bush behind the house. Ask what the fairies are like, and he will tell you, well, pretty much what Mr. Wentz tells us. From this and the like accounts, we form our ideas of fairies and fairy music, of ghosts, mermaids, pugas, and so forth. But there is no sequence of incidents, no hero, no heroine, no story. Again, ask the old man if he knows a folk tale or a story, and he will tell you at once, did you ever hear of the speckled bull? Did you ever hear of the well at the end of the world? Did you ever hear the tailor and the three beasts? Did you ever hear the hornless cow? Ask him to relate one of these, and if you get him in the right vein, which may be perhaps 1 time in 10, or if you induce the right thing, which you may do perhaps 9 times out of 10, you will find him begin with a certain gravity and solemnity at the beginning thus: there was once in old times, and in old times it was, a king in Ireland. Or perhaps a man who married a second wife, or perhaps a widow woman with only 1 son, and the tale proceeds to recount the life and adventures of heroes or heroines whose biographies told in Irish in a sort of stereotyped form may take from 10 minutes to half an hour to get through. Some stories would burn out a dip candle in the telling, or even last the whole night. But these stories have little or nothing to say to the questions raised in this book. The problem we have to deal with is a startling one, as this put before us by Mr. Wentz. Are these beings of the spirit world real beings, having a veritable existence of their own in a world of their own, or are they only the creation of the imagination of his informants and the tradition of bygone centuries? The newspaper, the national school, and the zeitgeist have answered to their own entire satisfaction that these things are imagination, pure and simple. Yet this offhand condemnation does not always carry with it a perfect conviction. We do not doubt the existence of tree martins or kingfishers, though 999 people out of every 1,000 pass their entire lives without being vouchsafed a glimpse of them in their live state. And may it not be the same with the creatures of the spirit world? May they not also exist, though only to 1 in 1,000 it be vouchsafed to behold them? The spirit creatures cannot be stuffed and put into museums like rare animals or birds, whose existence we might doubt of if we had not seen them there, yet they may exist just as such animals and birds do, though we cannot see them. I, at least, have often been tempted to think so. But the following considerations, partly drawn from comparative folklore, have made me hesitate about definitely accepting any theory. In the first place, then, viewing the Irish spirit world as a whole, we find that it contains, even on Mr. Wentz's showing, quite a number of different orders of beings of various shapes, appearances, size, and functions. Are we to believe that all those beings equally exist, and on the principle that there can be no smoke without a fire? Are we to hold that there would be no popular conception of the banshee, the leprechaun, or the Macnamara, sea maid or mermaid? I probably mispronounced that. And consequently no tales about them, if such beings did not exist and from time to time allow themselves to be seen, like the wood martin and the kingfisher. This question is moreover further complicated by the belief in the appearance of things that are or appear to be inanimate objects, not living beings such as the death coach or the phantom ship in full sail, the appearance of which Mr. Yeats has immortalized in one of his earliest and finest poems. Again, although the banshee, the leprechaun, the puka, and the like are most commonly known and usually seen creatures of the spirit world, yet great quantities of other appearances are believed to have been also sporadically met with. I very well remember sitting one night some 4 or 5 years ago in a hotel in Indianapolis, USA, and talking to 4 Irishmen, 1 or 2 of them very wealthy and all prosperous citizens of the United States. The talk happened to turn upon spirits, the only time during my entire American experiences in which such a thing happened, and each man of the 4 had a story of his own to tell, in which he was a convinced believer of ghostly manifestations seen by him in Ireland. 2 of these manifestations were of beings that would fall into no known category: a monstrous rabbit as big as an ass, which plunged into the sea, rabbits can swim, and a white heifer which ascended to heaven. There were 2 of them. I myself, when a boy of 10 or 11, was perfectly convinced that on a fine, early, dewy morning in summer, when people were still in bed, I saw a strange horse run round a 7-acre field of ours and change into a woman, who ran even swifter than the horse, and after a couple of courses around the field, disappeared into our haggard. I am sure, whatever I may believe today, no earthly persuasion would, at the time, have convinced me that I did not see this. Yet I never saw it again, and never heard of anyone else seeing the same. My object in mentioning these things is to show that if we concede the real objective existence of, let us say, the apparently well-authenticated banshee or woman fairy, where are we to stop? For any number of beings, more or less well authenticated, come crowding on her heels, so many indeed that they would point to a far more extensive world of different shapes than is usually suspected, not to speak of inanimate objects like the coach and the ship. Of course, there is nothing inherently impossible in all these shapes existing any more than in one of them existing, but they all seem to me to rest upon the same kind of testimony, stronger in the case of some, less strong in the case of others, and it is well to point out this clearly. My own experience is that the belief in the she, folk, and in other denizens of the invisible world is, in many places, rapidly dying. In reading folklore collections like those of Mr. Wentz and others, one is naturally inclined to exaggerate the extent and depth of these traditions. They certainly still exist and can be found if you go to search for them, but they often exist almost as if it were by sufferance, only in spots, and are ceasing to be any longer a power. Near my home in a western country, County Roscommon, rises gently a slope, which, owing to the flatness of the surrounding regions, almost becomes a hill, and is a conspicuous object for many miles upon every side. The old people called it in Irish Mulla na Shi. The name is now practically lost, and it is called Fairy Mount. So extinct have traditions of the she folk who lived within the hill become, that in a high ecclesiastic recently driving by asked his driver, was there an Irish name for the hill, and what was it? And his driver did not know. There took place a few years ago much talked of bog slide in the neighboring townland of Cloonshever, the meadow of the fairies, and many newspaper correspondents came to view it. One of the natives told a sympathetic newspaper reporter, "Sure, we always knew it was going to move, and that's why the place is called Cloonshever. The bog is always in a shiver." I have never been able to hear of any legends attached to what must have been at one time been held to be the headquarters of the she for a score of miles around it. Of all the beings in the Irish mythological world, the she are, however, apparently the oldest and most distinctive. Beside them in literature and general renown, all other beings sink into insignificance. A belief in them formerly dominated the whole of Irish life. The she, or the Tuatha De Danann, were a people like ourselves who inhabited the hills, not as a rule the highest and most salient eminences, but I think more usually the pleasant undulating slopes or gentle hillsides, who lived there a life of their own, marrying or giving in marriages, banqueting or making war, and leading there just as real a life as is our own. All Irish literature, particularly perhaps the colloquy of ancients, abounds with reference to them. To inquire how the Irish originally came by their belief in these beings, the Sidhe or the Tuatha De Danann, is to raise a question which cannot be answered. Why, any more than one can answer the question, where did the Romans obtain their belief in Bacchus and the Fauns, or the Greeks their own beliefs in the beings of Olympus? But granting such belief to have been indigenous to the Irish, as it certainly seems to have been, then the tall, handsome fairies of Binbulben and the Sligo district, about whom Mr. Wentz tells us so much interesting matter, might be accounted for as being a continuation of the tradition of the ancient Gaels, or a piece of hereditary inherent in the folk imagination. I mean, in other words, the tradition about these handsome dwellers within the hillsides having been handed down for ages and having been perhaps exceptionally well preserved in those districts, people saw just what they have always been told existed, or if I may so put it, they saw what they expected to see. Finvara, the king of the Connacht fairies in Knockmeda, or Castle Hackett in the County Galway, his queen, Nuala, and of all the beautiful forms seen by Mr. Wentz's seer witnesses, all the banshees and all the human figures, white women and so forth, who are seen in raths and moats and on hillsides, are the direct descendants, so to speak, of the Tuatha De Danann or the Sidhe. Of this, I think, there can be no doubt whatsoever. But then how are we to account for the little red-dressed men and women and the leprechauns? Yet are they any more wonderful than the pygmies of classic tradition? Is not the mermaid to be found in Greece? And is not the Lorelei as Germanic as the Kelpie is Chalcedonian? If we grant that all these creatures of primitive folk belief, then how they come to be so ceases to be a Celtic problem. It becomes a world problem. And I say, why is that a problem? But anyway, that's my opinion. But granted, as I say, that they were all creatures of primitive folk belief, then their occasional appearances or the belief in such may be accounted for in exactly the same way as I've suggested to be possible for in the case of the Binbulben fairies. As for the belief in ghosts or revenants, in Irish tas, I can't pronounce it, it seems to me this may possibly rest to some extent upon a different footing altogether. Here we are not confronted by a different order of beings of different shapes and attributes from our own, but only with the appearances amongst the living of men who were believed or known to be dead or far away from the scene of their appearances. Even those who may be most skeptical about the she-folk and the leprechauns are likely to be convinced on the mere evidence that the existence of astral bodies or doubles, or whatever we may call them, and the appearances of people, especially in the hour of their death, to other people who were perhaps hundreds of miles away at the time, is amply proven. Yet whatever may have been the case originally when a man was young, I do not think that this had in later times any more direct bearing upon the belief in the Sidhe, the leprechauns, the mermaid, and similar beings than upon the belief in the Greek pantheon, the Naiads, the Dryads, or the Fauns. All of which beliefs, probably arising originally from an animistic source, must have differentiated themselves at a very early period. Of course, every real apparition, every ghost apparition, tends now, and must have tended at all times, to strengthen every spirit belief. For do not ghost apparitions belong, in a way, to the same realm as all the others we have spoken of, that is, to a realm equally outside our normal experience? Another very interesting point, one hitherto generally overlooked, is this, that different parts of the Irish soil cherish different bodies of supernatural beings. The north of Ireland believes in beings unknown in the south, and northeast Leinster, I can't pronounce things, has spirits unknown to the west. Some places seem to be almost given up to special beliefs. Any outsider for existence who may have read that powerful and grisly book, La Legende de la Mort, by Anatole Lebras, in 2 large volumes, all about awful appearances of Ankou, death, who simply dominates the folklore of Brittany, who will probably be very much astonished to know that, though I have been collecting Irish folklore all my life, I have never met death figuring as a personality in more than 2 or 3 tales, and these mostly of a trivial or humorous description, though the death coach, and the belief in which is pretty general, does seem a kind of parallel to the creaking cart in which the Ankou rides. I would suggest, then, that the restriction of certain forms of spirits, if I may so call them, to certain localities may be due to race intermixture. I would imagine that where the people of a primitive tribe settled down most strongly, they also most strongly preserved in the memory of these supernatural beings who were peculiarly their own. The she-folk appear to be preeminently and distinctively Millicent. But the Ginnacotch, name of some little spirit in Meath and portion of Ulster, may have been believed in by a race entirely different from which they believed in the Munster sprites. Some of these beliefs may be Aryan, but many are probably pre-Celtic. Is it not strange that while the names and exploits of the great semi-mythological heroes of the various saga cycles of Ireland, Cuchulainn, Conor MacNessa, Finn, Oscar, O'Sheen, and the rest, are at present the inheritance of all of Ireland and are known in every part of it, there should still be, as I have said, supernatural beings believed in which are unknown outside of their own districts, and of which the rest of Ireland has never heard? If the inhabitants of the limited districts in which these are seen still think they see them, my suggestion is that the earlier race handed down an account of the primitive beings believed in by their own tribe, and later generations, if they saw anything, saw just what they were told existed. Whilst far from questioning the actual existence of certain spiritual forms and apparitions, I venture to throw out these considerations for what they may be worth, and I desire again to thank Mr. Wentz for all the valuable data he has collected for throwing light upon so interesting a question. Ratra, French Park, County Roscommon, Ireland, September 1910. And I apologize for my butchering of many of the Gaelic and Brythonic languages, because I don't speak those, at least not yet.